Welcome, everybody, to our next session of CrafterCMS Live, Building Dynamic Web Experiences with Crafter and Next.js with Tony Field from Kingsway Digital. Tony's Chief Solution Architect at Kingsway Digital, which is a certified solution partner here at CrafterCMS. Again, we welcome questions from the audience, so if you have any, please enter your questions using the Q&A button below on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And again, if you're watching from the lobby, you'll need to join the session in order to ask questions. Tony, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike. Really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for attending today. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me. My name is Tony Field, CEO and Chief Solution Architect at Kingsway Digital. At Kingsway Digital, we make beautiful, engaging web content management solutions for businesses, and we're proud to be a partner of Crafters. Today, we're going to talk about building dynamic experiences with CrafterCMS and Next.js. We'll go over some integration best practices. We'll share some lessons learned with projects like this, and there'll be plenty of time for question afterwards. So with that, let's dive right in. If you're here, you probably know what Next.js is, but for the few of you who don't or who may be curious, Next.js is a React framework for building full stack web applications. It's wildly popular in the market today. Using Next.js, you use React components to build your user interface, and the platform provides the runtime, tooling, compiling, bundling, etc. Next.js includes file system-based routing using a new scheme called the app router. Rendering can be done on the client side or on the server side, and it provides full TypeScript support. There are many, many more features and capabilities offered by Next.js, and if you're interested, I encourage you to take a closer look at the plethora of courses available online, including nextjs.org. But for today, these are the features that are relevant for us. When you build a site using Next.js, you have several different deployment choices. At a high level, you can choose static site generation, in which Next.js exports your content to static files that can be then served by a regular web server. This performs extremely well and has very low hosting costs, but pages must be generated before they can be served. This can be tricky on a technical level, although Next.js has some excellent tools to make this work great. Alternately, you can choose to deploy your site as a single-page application. In ASPA, your site is deployed onto a regular web server as a set of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, plus your static assets like images and videos. The client downloads the HTML and JavaScript files, but makes dynamic calls to an API endpoint to retrieve content for the site. This model is great because hosting is simple and inexpensive, but also content is returned directly from the source. Single page application delivery via static files is not great for public sites, though, because search engines don't all hydrate the site in order to index the content. And often the payload downloaded for a single page can be many times larger than the content itself due to all of the JavaScript. Finally, Next.js supports dynamic delivery. In this deployment model, Next.js hosts the front end of the site on a node server. The Next.js server can make calls to external servers to access data, and business logic can be executed on the node server, on an external server, or can be shipped to the client as JavaScript. Next supports both traditional client React components, as well as the comparatively new React server components. Dynamic delivery with Next.js is flexible and powerful and is Next recommended deployment model. So, how does this fit in with CrafterCMS? Crafter already provides an excellent high-performance delivery architecture out of the box with FreeMarker, Groovy, Spring, and caching on CloudFront. But you can augment this framework or replace it using Next.js. When you're choosing an integration architecture for your CrafterCMS Next.js solution, there are many factors to consider. First, consider your overall deployment architecture. Can your site support headless content delivery? Or do you require the CMS to provide both content and UI delivery? You may not be in a scenario where headless is a viable architecture, so you need to know that. Consider your development team. Does your team have expertise in a specific technology already? Are they experts in working with something other than React? You're going to want to brush up on React when working with Next. Do you already have Next.js deployed in-house? If so, you can hit the ground running, especially after this presentation. What's the situation with your DevOps team? Do they already know Next.js? Have they deployed it in-house? What deployment architectures have they used? Static, dynamic? Will you be building a CI/CD process around your web front end? Or would you prefer that this is all handled internally within Crafter? Next.js is a great solution, but it is an additional system that will need to be maintained. What about your authors? Are you looking for a full in-context editing experience with Experience Builder? What about in-context editing without Experience Builder? Or do you just want to expose the site in preview, but no in-context editing? Or do you have a completely contextless case study and deployment will be done entirely in forms? Each of these authoring styles may make sense depending on your situation. You'll also want to think about whether CrafterCMS will be delivering content to other channels. Will your content be entirely served via an API like REST and GraphQL? Will you be delivering content via the Crafter JavaScript SDK? There's a lot to consider. You've thought about some of the key factors affecting your integration. Let's now look at some deployment options. We're going to look at 3 options. 1, a static deployment of the site running in SPA mode, in which Crafter's built-in web server hosts the site. 2nd, a static deployment of the site in SPA mode, but hosted on an external web server. And 3rd, dynamic, where the app is hosted externally on Node and Next.js server is present on the front end. The first option provides preview natively in the Crafter UI, and we'll get into that in detail shortly. The last 2 options provide preview through Crafter's built-in proxy, and we'll cover that in detail as well too. We'll look at all 3 of these deployment options with a simple and advanced integration approach. So we're going to dig into that. We'll start simple. When you're deploying your site as a single page application, whether you're hosting it on Crafter or on a standalone web server, you won't see a significant impact on functionality, but there are a few differences. When hosting on Crafter in SPA mode, JavaScript, CSS, and HTML files reside in Crafter and are served under the static assets folder. The index.html file ends up being dynamically included in the default SPA free marker template, so some server-side data can be injected into it if you like. Also, because you're running server-side, you can filter access to these files and requests dynamically if that's something that you need to do. You will need to set up cores, and you can host more than one single-page app using this model. It's important to note that each time your site's code is modified, you will have to deploy it onto Crafter and then publish it to the delivery instance. When you're hosting externally using the Crafter proxy, a proxy server that's built into Crafter Studio will make requests to your site and render them directly inside Studio. This solution totally decouples your front end and your back end in a typical Jamstack configuration. And so deployments are independent. That means you'll need to synchronize them when you change your content model and your front end. But this is great when you have separate teams working on the front end and back end. Okay, so you still have cores to deal with, and you can host more than one site with this model as well. Both of these options can make calls into Crafter to execute custom business logic as REST services or FreeMarker or both. So very similar, but a couple of specific differences with these two. So which one would you pick? Which one should you pick? Do you have a standard in your organization already? Do you have separate front-end and back-end development teams? Or do you have any deployment restrictions? The answers to these questions will guide you down the path of selecting one or the other. For our next option, we'll look at a simple dynamic site. This site will be running on Next.js, running on an independent node server. In many ways, it is a lot like a proxied static site. It's also fully decoupled and serves content using the Crafter proxy. Content is served to the authors in preview using the Crafter proxy. But with the server running in the front end, you pick up a few major advantages. Lightweight business logic can be accomplished on node directly. Users can be authenticated on the client on Next.js as well as on Crafter. Next can make authenticated requests to Crafter by setting simple authentication headers into your requests from Next to Crafter. So if you want to do this, look at header-based authentication for details in the doc. But in a nutshell, you're basically just going to send a username, a key, and the user's groups over to Crafter, and Crafter will map the user's groups to roles. At that point, Crafter's built-in role-based authentication authorization kicks in to protect content. You can even make authenticated calls to Crafter to run custom business logic via REST and Groovy and FreeMarker, or both. You can also make custom and authenticated calls to Crafter's built-in open search infrastructure to query for content. So much more power with this deployment architecture. So now that we've looked at a few simple integration patterns, let's take it up a notch. We're going to look at three major areas that often factor in React deployments: alternate authentication methods, including static site authentication, experience builder, and integrating routing. We'll start with alternate authentication methods. So besides Crafter's simple header-based authentication, other options exist as well. You can even secure static sites quite easily. So we'll start with the static sites. If you need authentication, your visitors will authenticate their client through a system like OpenID Connect or by other means. These will generate a token that can be stored in the browser. Send that token to Crafter. You can do this in your fetch requests, or you can configure authorization headers in the Crafter SDK so that it sends those requests for you. Depending on your provider or your token, you may be able to leverage existing Crafter plugins, or you may need to teach Crafter how to use your token. Essentially, you will validate the audience, date, signature, and then set the user into the user context on the server. Once that's complete, standard Crafter authorization rules apply, just like they do for the header authentication method. If your site is dynamic and you're running through a Node.js server, a node server, the same general process applies. However, with Node on the front end, you can construct your own token however you'd like. Of course, if it's a custom token, you'll have to write your own decoder. But if you're relaying a common one, as long as you sort out the audience and key, you should be all set. Crafter will recognize who you are and you're off to the races with authentication. Setting this up varies in complexity depending on your ID provider. So, for example, if your incoming token only provides authentication information, but you don't know the user's groups or roles, Crafter can't really authorize much. Somebody's going to have to go get more information about that user. In Spring Security, this is part of the user details. But if you're running in SPA mode, you don't have much of a choice other than to have Crafter run those lookups for you, which means some extra code on your side when you process your token for the first time. Once you've retrieved that additional information back, you probably want to send it back to the client so that Crafter doesn't have to do that lookup again. Consider a token or short expiry cookie. Be sure to validate it before you trust it again when it comes back to you. If you're running on Node, you can follow the SPA mode approach, or you can make the call directly from Next.js and send the data back to Crafter. When you're using React as your front end, it's definitely nice to have server-side logic available for processing things like this. It's very, very smooth, very straightforward, and Crafter's built-in authorization infrastructure works very smoothly. That wraps up authentication. I want to look now at Experience Builder. So we haven't really talked about this in depth much, but you've heard a lot about it. So what is the deal with Experience Builder? We deploy CMSs to get our team's message out to its audience. If your team doesn't like using the CMS, your message just won't get out as clearly. A well thought out, intuitive content architecture is just the beginning of creating a positive experience for your team. Your core assets, your enterprise content, may not be, actually probably isn't designed first for web. It could already exist. It could be originally built for another system, like an app or a direct-to-print system, or just for download. But compelling experiences are crafted. Your users need to see what their messages will look like on delivery channels. Crafter's preview pane provides this. Experience Builder allows authors to not only preview content as it will be shown, but also compose content and experiences visually through the UI. Crafter supplies a TypeScript SDK that includes a complete set of React components that allow developers to provide in-context editing and visual experience building using an intuitive drag-and-drop user interface right in Crafter Studio. You can bring these to your team when deploying on Next.js and leverage all the benefits of both server-side rendering and client-side rendering. Simply add the XB components to your Next.js React client components, and you're off to the races. If you're deploying statically, you will only have client components to work with. You don't get any pre-rendering, and so for that reason, it's not ideal for public sites. But if you're deploying dynamically on Next.js, client and server React components are available to you. Use server components for layouts and things that are pre-configured, and use Experience Builder on your client components. You'll get Next.js pre-rendering for SEO on your client components. And that is the core of seeing Experience Builder working on a Next.js powered site. So shifting gears now, moving on to routing. This is an interesting topic. URLs are arguably the most important kind of content on your site. They are the entry point to everything. They're written on billboards, they're texted, they're verbally spoken. They're some of the most carefully considered content on the web. Yes, of course, the content they reveal is ultimately what you're selling. But if I said CNN.com or Cisco.com, you would know exactly what you would be getting there. Your content team needs to own the URL space. Next.js provides out-of-the-box file-based routing. The path in the app router maps directly to a URL for a page. Yes, dynamic routes do exist, and we'll get to those. But these Next.js file-based paths are primarily all hard-coded. On the flip side, Crafter provides experience curation that gives authors full control over their URLs. They create entirely new pages, not just new products or articles. So in an advanced Next.js integration, we need to ensure that Crafter drives the URL namespace. You'll want to allow Next.js to do some pre-rendering of data from Crafter, but ultimately leverage its wildcard dynamic route route support to allow it to seed routing to the content management system. Some of Next.js built-in app routing is fine for hard-coded app-like functionality that is distinct from managed content. Those URLs don't serve managed content, they serve an app. So it's not the same thing. Smaller apps can be embedded inside web pages using the marker pattern, and we will cover that in a separate topic shortly. So to summarize this, URLs are content. Next.js provides a simple routing solution, but a well-crafted site puts the control of the URL into the hands of the content team. Leverage Next's dynamic routes in the app router to drive dynamic sites that read content and URLs from Crafter. In our next section, we'll talk about some functions that help Next.js to preload this data. And so with that, we move into tips and tricks. I'm going to cover a few tips and tricks and lessons learned that relate to what we've just heard. And some of these are going to get a little bit more technical. We're going to cover content modeling tips and tricks, including some general principles, content relationships and data sources, as well as rich text fields. We'll cover custom business logic, and we'll wrap up with some interesting tips related to working with the proxy. So let's get started. So this is not the only tip or trick related to content modeling. An entire course would be needed to just scratch the surface of this topic. But when you're rendering a content model, when you're building a content model, you need to think about why you're creating your content type. What is the purpose of the type that you're creating? Is it your core business artifact? These can be reused across multiple contexts. People in your organization will usually know exactly what you mean when you call them by name, like a white paper, an episode, a contract, an article, product summary, images, videos, content, like definitions, taxonomies, and so on. Is it ephemeral content that you need for your current delivery channel? These are critical for your website and mobile app, but they aren't reused anywhere else. And so they won't really be reused in different contexts, like a carousel or a call to action or a promo link. Is your content type structural in that it provides organizational information to your delivery channel? You can think of these as experience configuration that's managed by the content team. So like nav structures, featured item lists, and that kind of thing. Think about how you might model these. You probably need to have more stakeholders aligned for the creation of your core business artifacts than you do for the channel artifacts like carousels. So think very carefully about the content model for those core elements. Focus on their role and what they represent. This will result in the best alignment for authors and will actually greatly facilitate reuse and allow you to get the most value out of your core assets. Consult with an expert if you're not sure how to proceed. Ephemeral web artifacts and widgets are less important in this regard, but they still play a role. These types can be defined much more rapidly to suit a specific purpose and then discarded or sunset when the needs change. So why does all this matter for Next.js? Content reuse across contexts and content sharing are highly impacted by the quality of the content model. When you build your content model, you will have relationships between your content instances. How do those relationships work? Crafter supports the notion of shared and embedded content relationships. When relating shared content to another instance, you're referring to an independently addressable content instance in the repository. Certainly, that can be reused. This includes your enterprise content, which is reusable in multiple contexts and stands on its own. But we also want to reuse things like channel glue content, like delivery channel specific artifacts, like carousels and modules, text snippets, and so on, within the context of an individual site. They're both shared content, but they are very different from one another. And that distinction is important to think about. So the other kind of content is embedded content. Embedded content isn't independent. It is defined inside the context of the containing instance. You rarely want to use this for individual artifacts. They're great for composing experiences. You can embed text blocks in an article, for example. You can augment content relationships with an embedded adapter. Sometimes you may want a hybrid, like a rendering context clue that denotes to the build team that something special is going to happen in this location on a page, but you don't want authors creating embedded variations of these all the time. For this type of thing, use a singleton component to mark that functionality in a composition. Let's take a look at what this actually looks like. In this diagram, we have a schematic of a content model, of a page that's been rendered. We talk about different kinds of components, different kinds of content in terms of the following design patterns. We have embedded only components. That's the content that'll never be reused, has no meaning outside of its immediate context, like embedded text, rich text blocks, and that sort of thing. Adapters that provide that context-specific augmentation in a relationship. So for example, in this case, we've got a 2-up adapter that converts a row here into 2 columns. We've got another one down here. These adapters are almost always embedded in your page. We see 3 adapters in this page here, one that's 2 equal width, and one that is wider than the other. So the adapters take the horizontal nature of a row and just divide it up into a couple of different slots where new content can be added. It provides additional structure that the author can control. The last type here is markers. Markers denote where in a context you want non-CMS behavior to appear. So in this example, for example, here we have like a nav marker, there's a calendar widget, we have a external component marker here. These are great in React projects because they would typically be implemented as in standalone React components that have no dependency on the CMS, but they're positioned on the page by the CMS. So the author is curating the experience by defining where these items are rendered. All right, there we go. Okay, rich text. When you need a rich text block in your content model, think about what its role is in the content type that you're creating. Will it be representing a large block of multimedia content, like with pictures, diagrams, and videos? If a text block is fine, then great. Crafter supports both plain text and rich text blocks, and you can even include images directly inside those text blocks, and Crafter will recognize them and manage dependencies accordingly. Though that's likely a quick and dirty solution that may not scale across delivery channels or languages and that sort of thing. So for more advanced rich text content, you may want to use a block model. This would include blocks for each media type, like paragraphs in a rich text form, as well as images, videos, doc references, maybe even ad markers if you want to control where ads go in your content. Just be careful if you start coupling ephemeral content types into your enterprise content block model. Err on the side of using stable and reliable building blocks in your content model. But in the block model, your body, the body of your component is an array of building blocks like these, maybe an array of 1, 2, 3, or dozens. Rendering it is a bit more complicated, but it's not bad. Crafter has a notion of a dynamic content renderer and an accompanying content type map that exists to solve this problem. So they're used together to iterate over all of the content instances in the array so that the correct component can be selected to render each content type in the array. If your enterprise content uses the block model and external parties will be consuming that content, think of the impact that the block model will have on the content API, right? You're getting an array back instead of just a rich text block. How are you going to address that? Through training? Will you create special tools to support that the consumers of that API? Or maybe a mix of both? It seems simple on the surface, but with the block model growing in popularity across the CMS space, it's good to understand how this design pattern works. Okay, moving on to data sources. This is a quick but important tip relating to data sources, Next.js, and Experience Builder. When you define a content relationship in your Crafter content model, Crafter provides 3 data source options: component, shared content, and embedded. Experience Builder functionality is exposed only through the component data source. That allows you to use drag and drop functionality. Component doesn't allow extremely fine-grained control over how you select your content, though, so you have to get a little creative. Specifically, you select several content types, the paths that correspond to browsing and searching, and whether you want embedded, shared, browse, or search functionality to be active. But these can't be applied against individual content types. So all of the selected options get applied to all of the selected types. It's also not possible to remove the option to create new content either. So if the folder that you name is not where you want your content created, it's possible that content will get created in an undesirable location. So there's an easy workaround for this that works reasonably well. And that's to set up a separate data source for each content type and to try to gain some control over the folders. There are some limitations there as well, but it works. The shared content data source doesn't support XB for drag and drop, but it does support, it does work. Specifying whether you want to create new browse, whether you want to activate create new, browse, and search functionality. And it does allow you to control the location where the content is placed when it's created. However, it doesn't let you filter the content based on the content type. So if a user has access to a folder, then they'll be able to work with all of the content that's in that folder without any kind of further restrictions imposed by the data source. That's usually okay if you have an organized folder structure for your content. But if you need Experience Builder, then this option may not be the right one for you. The third option, finally, of course, is embedded. And obviously, there's no searching or browsing for embedded components, and that's fine. But it does allow you to specify the type that you'd like to be able to work with and embed. And so, of course, embedded data sources do work with Experience Builder as well. They're XB friendly. Okay. Let's talk about custom logic. CrafterCMS provides very robust server-side logic and processing to support processing support on the platform itself. And yes, there are REST APIs and GraphQL APIs that you can use. But content-rich apps will be doing sophisticated things with content, and feeding them out to your UI one at a time is rarely optimal. With custom logic in Crafter, you can create request filters. Next.js calls this middleware. Selected scheduled jobs, controllers for pages and components, custom REST services, extend GraphQL, define your own classes, and much, much more. But for the purposes of a lightweight Next.js implementation, there are a few things that are likely to be very useful. First, you can create a REST service that pre-processes the navbar content based on user permissions. This will allow the site to preload the navbar for the current user. On that note, you can also create a bootstrapping, create content bootstrapping, basically, a dedicated service for that purpose, so that your app can make one call to Crafter to initialize itself, cutting down on unnecessary round trips between Crafter and the client. It's possible to perform content transformations. So rather than having to optimize your content model for delivery, your content model can be optimized for reusability. while any sort of denormalization or other format alterations that need to be done can be done on Crafter server side, improving the user experience for your visitors while retaining high quality content model. And finally, of course, you can communicate with external systems or resources like Lambdas, external APIs, queues, etc. So custom logic in Crafter is written in Groovy, and you can leverage Java and other JVM artifacts via dynamic inclusions, like with using Groovy grapes. As a bonus, scripting and debugging with these resources is quick and efficient. So some very good use cases for custom logic when you're working with Next.js. And for our last tip, I want to talk about flagging the authoring environment. This seems a little obscure, but it's something that's quite relevant. When you think of the rendering architecture for your Next.js site, you already have Crafter authoring and Crafter delivery. Are you going to have a separate front end for authoring and delivery as well? Like a separate Next.js server for each of those? Or do you want to have just one that serves a dual purpose? It is a solid approach to use a single front end that serves both purposes. That front end will need to know which Crafter instance it should be communicating with, though, so that it can request content from the right server. You don't want to serve unpublished content to the public. You want to make sure that your live site is serving only published content, for example. It'll need to know which backend it's communicating with. But once this is established, you will have one single front end pulling content from either authoring or delivery, depending on your context. So how does Crafter know which server it should use for a given context? Crafter's SDK, the JavaScript SDK, has some code that tries to figure it out, and it makes reasonable educated guesses. It's usually quite effective for static sites. But if you're using Next.js to serve your content, then a very simple and secure solution to having Crafter is to actually have Crafter set a flag along with a shared secret in the headers that the preview proxy sends to Next.js. Then Next.js can validate the secret and trust that it's talking to authoring. If there's no flag or no valid secret, it operates in delivery mode. Very, very simple, straightforward, and robust. So what else might a Next.js app do knowing that it's talking to authoring instead of delivery? Well, for starters, Experience Builder needs to run on authoring. And so when it's in the delivery, when it's in a delivery context, it's just a pass-through for your content. So the Experience Builder code base needs to know whether it's authoring or not. You'll also want to differentiate how static assets are referenced. So on the authoring environment, you'll need the Crafter site parameter added to your URLs so that Crafter Studio, which may be managing many sites, knows which site it's talking to. On the delivery side, you don't need this because your delivery system will be configured to serve just one site. Alternate delivery configuration is possible, but that's a separate topic. Also, when Next.js knows it's dealing with authoring, you may choose different types of rendering, content loading or aggregation, etc. Maybe you're adding a debug overlay for developers. Maybe you're flagging content by its metadata, like premium content versus public content. Consider using the React context provider feature to expose that information throughout your client app. Okay, so in this presentation, we talked about building dynamic experiences with CrafterCMS and Next.js. We got a high-level introduction to Next. We looked at various integration options that are available, and we covered both simple integration and advanced integration approaches for single-page app projects as well as dynamic sites. We finished up with a series of relevant tips, tricks, and lessons learned in working with Next.js and Crafter. Again, my name is Tony Field, and I've been your presenter today. My firm has been working with Crafter and Next.js for several years, in both internally and with a number of clients. It's a solid, decoupled deployment architecture with enough integration options to fit many common deployment scenarios. So thank you for listening. We have some time for questions, so I think we can open that up now.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. It's a great technical deep dive into building web experiences with Crafter and Next.js. And we've got a few questions in here. I'll remind the audience again, use the Q&A button below to submit your questions for Tony. So Tony, first question. In Mike's keynote, he talked about composability as a growing trend in the industry. How can I create a composable front end using the technology you're talking about here?
Okay, so one of the ways that we can do that is by using some of these the like marker content types that we talked about earlier. So if we slip back to the diagram slide here, actually, we can see. So in this is a sort of schematic that represents a content model for a page. So you can see there's like a hero image on there, a nav marker, an adapter with some content in it, another adapter with content, another adapter with content. But then there are these markers that are sprinkled throughout. And these markers are placeholders that the author puts in place on these pages to say to the build team, we want to actually include external functionality here. So you need to, think of it as like an alias or like a pointer to say, this is where we want to bring in external content from another location. So you can have something that pulls in content from, maybe you're rendering a widget for for HubSpot, or you're rendering a calendar widget, or some other kind of content from an external source, live video feeds, for example, that kind of thing. So the markers are a good way of doing that, that give authors the curation control, while you have at the same time the content is completely the content and data that's served out of there is completely coming from the other system.
Cool. All right. Another question. Do you have a go-to default integration architecture between these systems that you fall back to if another reason doesn't come up?
Probably the Next.js server-side rendered deployment architecture. That's next recommendation. A and B, it's also more powerful and a little easier to integrate with. There's a little bit of extra overhead with the fact that there's a separate server to manage, but if you're going to go down the route of using Next.js, you might as well use the full feature set that it provides.